As we move deeper into the season of Lent, we'll be looking at particular stories that happened during Holy Week as a way of getting us all ready for Easter. And as we were choosing these stories, we realized that most of these never get preached on. We hear them on Maundy, Thursday, and at our Good Friday service, but without any comment and without any story. The Last Supper, as Brianna just said, is probably the most famous supper in all of history. I asked Joe, what's the first thing that comes into your mind when you hear the words Last Supper? And he said, Leonardo da Vinci. And it's virtually impossible to not picture that scene, and now all of you are picturing that scene of the Last Supper, and how Jesus and his disciples are all sitting on one side of a table. It's as if they've all been watching a game on a big screen TV. But they actually wouldn't have been sitting in chairs at the Last Supper. They would have been lying on couches. That's the way you dined in the first century. They'd have been laying on couches around a low center table and in the Roman fashion. But in Da Vinci's painting, the disciples are looking around in shocked disbelief because Jesus has just made that revelation saying that one of them who's at table with him is going to betray him, and it cuts them to the heart. Well, that supper must have been seared into their memories. And there's more than one memory of the Last Supper. If you read the four gospel accounts, they're all a little bit different. John's is most different of all. He doesn't really even talk about the supper. He just talks about what happens after supper, and it's in that window right up there, the third from the end. After supper, Jesus takes off his outer garment, wraps a towel around his waist, and washes the disciples' feet one by one. Many different memories of just one meal. Well, meals make memories, and the Last Supper is not the only memory of a meal that we find in the Gospels. We've already heard a couple of them this year. Jesus eating with Mary and Martha, and Jesus eating at the home of Zacchaeus. You know that if there had been social media back then, the disciples would totally have been posting selfies of themselves at these meals. Check it out, we're hanging out with Zacchaeus, right? Or eating with dear friends. That Martha sure can cook. Life is good. Well, in the Gospels, Jesus either seems to be on his way to supper, eating supper, or just coming from supper. That's how he was remembered. He was remembered through the meals that people ate with him. Meals make memories. So what important meals are seared onto your minds that you cannot forget? Years after your wedding reception, is it the taste of the cake, or the chicken, or the beef? You close your eyes and you can still smell the bread your mother made coming out of the oven, or you can close your eyes and smell that gooey, tomatoey hamburger helper mess that Dad made on the nights when he cooked. Thanksgiving dinner, Christmas supper, you look around at the table and you can still see those faces. Meals live on in our memories in the way that other experiences do not, because they combine that yearning sense of hunger in our bellies, but also with taste, texture and smell, and being full, and relationships and good conversations around the table. All of those things that go up into making us human, spiritual and physical. So is it any wonder that one of the central sacraments of our worship that happens month after month takes place at a table right in our midst, at that table? Is it any wonder that the meal that the disciples remembered most was the one that was most full of emotion for them? The last one. Now, although I've had many people die in my life who are dear to me, I only remember one Last Supper. It's the last meal that I shared with my father. It wasn't his Last Supper, but it was the last time that we were together and ate a meal before he died. After he became sick with leukemia 10.5 years ago, he and my mother moved into the home of a couple in their congregation. And this couple lived in a farmhouse, but they added several different bedrooms around it in order for elderly people who needed care to move in, and it avoided them having to go into a nursing home. It was a very quiet, very peaceful place. There were 3 other elderly residents at the time. 2 of them slept all day long, and one was a little woman that sat in the corner, and she was a baby doll. And she rocked it and sang to it all day long. My parents' room was a converted sun porch, and through it he could look through the big windows at the birds that he so loved. He was a bird watcher to the end. Now, I drove up for a visit to see him before he died, and I wanted to do something special for my parents and something special for this couple that was taking good care of them. But what do you do for a home in which everyone is homebound? Well, I announced that I would cook supper for everyone, so I leafed through the available cookbooks in the kitchen and I finally settled on a recipe for chicken parmesan. And it was easy enough to cook for a group. You pound out the chicken and dip it in butter and garlic and then in breadcrumbs and pop it in the oven. My dad still had enough of an appetite at the time where he could enjoy it. He loved to eat, and it was good to see him eat again. And after supper, I played the piano and we sang some hymns that he loved. Heaven is a wonderful place, and how great thou art. And I remember more about that meal than anything else from the last time that we spent together. Meals make memories. The writer Rodney Clapp says that one of the key questions to ask about meals is this: who eats with whom? Who eats with whom? Who do you typically eat with? Probably your family, people that are close to you. We also tend to eat with people that are from the same educational or economic background, people we feel comfortable with. And our everyday meals also tend to sort us out based on social status. Can you afford to shop at Whole Foods, or does your budget take you to Aldi? Is your name on the guest list? Did you get the e-bike? Can you afford to eat in a restaurant at which others can only look at through the window? But now if we ask that question of Jesus, who eats with whom? We find that there's no easy way to pin down his social network. He's completely unconcerned about status. He's completely unconcerned about his own public image. And he tends to seek out people to eat with that others avoid. When's the last time you shared a table with a prostitute, right? Or when's the last time you sat down for a meal with a notorious thief? Jesus did. Well, at the Last Supper, he's among friends. And his disciples are there, probably the women who traveled with him, because Passover was a family festival. You ate it with people that were closest to you. And this ragtag group of people that followed him around, his chosen family, they all would have gathered together in that spare room. But when we come to the Last Supper, we also find that Jesus' chosen family was just as dysfunctional as the families we didn't choose. It was a family capable of deep love, but also of deep pain. Judas, his betrayer, is there, dipping his hand into the same bowl. Peter, who denies him, is there, putting his lips to the same cup. And the 10 other men sitting there with him, the men that he called brothers, the ones he should have been able to count on to the very end. By the end of the night, they've all fled into the evening, into the darkness, leaving Jesus utterly alone. Well, that's the sort of crowd Jesus eats his Last Supper with. Those are the kinds of people that he chooses to call family. Although he knows absolutely everything about them and how deeply they will fail him, he loves them, he feeds them, he forgives them, even before they walk out on him. Jesus takes a loaf of bread and he prays that ancient prayer, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. He breaks it and gives it to them and says, take, eat, this is my body. Then he takes a cup and says, drink of this, all of you. This is my blood poured out for forgiveness. Now we hear those words every month at that table, so they no longer startle us. But the disciples would have been shocked. Drink his blood? Consuming any animal blood at all was forbidden in their law. No black pudding in their full English breakfast. The Old Testament says that the life of the flesh is in its blood. Blood is life. So to eat his body and to drink his blood means to be fed by the very life of Jesus. The Word of God becomes flesh and blood. It's his life that he gives us, not just ideas, not doctrine or words, but his very self. And the life that is flowing through that blood we call forgiveness. The Last Supper teaches us that there are some things that we simply can't do for ourselves. Through most of our life, we have to show our credentials. We're expected to justify our worth, pay our own way, split the check, live up to somebody else's expectations in order to be welcome at the table. But at the table of Jesus, none of that, absolutely nothing that we can do matters. We can only receive. When we come to his table, we are all needy people with our mouths open and our hands stretched out to receive. And he says to us, all of you, take and drink. All of you, Judas, Peter, betrayer, denier, doubter, the whole cast of cowards, all of you drink deeply because I love you, and you may not be welcome anywhere else, but you're welcome at my table. Now, if you ever cook supper at the Lincoln Park Community Shelter, you'll find that they encourage you to fix a plate for yourself and pull up a chair to one of the tables and sit down with the shelter guests that you are serving so that they're not strangers anymore and so that you might make a new friend. And I often cook supper at the shelter with some of our classes of new members, and I always fix the same thing. Has anyone cooked dinner at the shelter with me here? What did we fix? Chicken Parmesan. That's right. It's the same recipe I first learned when I fixed that Last Supper for my dad. Pounding out the chicken, dipping it in butter and garlic, coating it with breadcrumbs. Now, I never make that at home. It's too fattening. But I always make it at the shelter because it's the only recipe that I actually know completely by heart. And I don't think about death when I cook that meal over and over again. A meal that was born in sadness has now become a meal that is joyful because it's a meal that shares life. Meals make memories, and the life-giving meals are the ones that shape our lives and that we share with others. You live them and embody them in new ways with new people at the table. Well, today our communion table is sitting there empty. We did not plan to consider the Last Supper story on a Communion Sunday. However, there are communion tables waiting for you in the gym, and you can smell that they are ready. Because every meal for us becomes a meal shared with Jesus. The Last Supper is really our first supper. Because when we drink deeply of that cup, it shapes the rest of our lives. And it shapes every other meal that we eat after it. The cup he gives to us is the love and forgiveness poured out of the beating heart of God. And no matter how often we drink of it, and no matter how many people come to the table, that cup will never run dry. After supper, they sang a hymn. So